You know the story. A young woman with impossibly long hair, locked in a tall tower, a witch keeping watch, and a prince who climbs her hair to steal away love and escape. But the version you grew up with, the one Disney polished into a cottage industry of ribbons and romance, is a lie of gentleness. The original thread is stained with hunger, property, forced confinement, sexual control, and exile. Once you follow the tale back through its paper trail, you discover that Rapunzel is not a princess rescued from loneliness. She is a map of how early modern Europe controlled women's bodies, land, and lineage, and the fairy tale is a sanitized cover-up of real cruelties. Picture Naples in 1634. You can smell wet earth and parsley crushed underfoot. Giambattista Basile is writing Petronella in the Pentamerone, and his heroine is born out of a mother's desperate craving for garden herbs. Court records are not quoted here, but the herbalist's manuals are. John Gerard's Herbal, published in 1597, lists Campanula rapunculus as a vegetable with medicinal uses, not an innocent salad garnish, but a plant wrapped in obsession and folk belief. In Basile's Naples, the theft of a plant from a walled garden is not quaint. It is theft of another household's food supply, a breach that triggers bargaining between households. In Petronella, a supernatural guardian claims the child in exchange for the stolen parsley. That guardian figure, when you peel back the charm, is the legal fiction of property rights, claiming offspring as compensation for violated land. Now shift to Paris in 1698. Picture a candlelit salon where Charlotte Rose de Caumont de la Force writes Persinnette. The scene is perfumed, baroque, but the story she shapes is darker. Persinnette's tower is not merely isolation for innocence, it is surgical control. La Force's version introduces sexual intent more overtly. A prince spies, intrudes, and Persinnette's punishment is brutal and permanent. Historical context sharpens the edges. In late 17th century France, the control of aristocratic women's sexuality was enforced by families, convents, and legal instruments that could confine or marry them off. Persinnette's exile after pregnancy reflects real punishments delivered to women who transgressed sexual norms. Banishment, annulment, and loss of family protection, recorded in parish censuses and marriage bans of the period. But it gets darker when you land in Germany with the Brothers Grimm. Picture Kassel and Göttingen in the early 19th century. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm publish Rapunzel in Kinder- and Hausmärchen in 1812, drawing on earlier variants. They polish language, but the skeletal horror remains. A mother trades her child for a garden plant. A witch imprisons the child in a tower. A prince climbs. They consummate. She bears twins, and discovery leads to punitive exile. Courtly sensibilities of the Grimm's era tried to domesticate sexuality for children, and later editions excised or softened passages. Yet, if you consult the manuscript tradition, the Pentamerone, 1634, La Force's Persinnette, 1698, and the Grimm's 1812 text, a pattern emerges. Hair is not mere romance. Hair is a conduit, a rope-like tool that turns a private body into a public access point. The prince's ascent is voyeurism made infrastructure, a penetration through which social order is both violated and negotiated. Here's what that hair really represents: control of access. In feudal Europe, property owners controlled who had access to land, to labor, to women. The witch or ogress who claims the child in Basile and the old woman in the Grimm tale function as guardians of property, sometimes literal landholders, sometimes the community's moral enforcers. The bargaining mother who steals Rapunzel from the neighbor's garden invokes legal disputes over gleaning and rights of the poor. Parish records and municipal ordinances from 16th and 17th century towns brim with cases where the poor were prosecuted for gleaning or taking vegetables. Those legal files read like the thin, legal counterpart to the little garden theft that triggers an entire life seizure. But the horror doesn't stop at property. The tower is a legal and sexual prison. Real women were sealed away in towers and convents as instruments of patrimony. Anne Boleyn's arrival at the Tower of London on May 2, 1536, recorded in state papers, is a concrete touchstone. She is confined, accused, and executed on May 19, 1536. Lady Jane Grey's imprisonment in June 1553 and execution the following year are catalogued in Tudor letters and Tower records. These are not fairy tales. These are state uses of imprisonment to control dynastic lines, to silence inconvenient female power. Rapunzel's imprisonment echoes these uses, to bar a woman from forming alliances that threaten property transmission, to hide an unapproved pregnancy, to control who touches and who claims a woman's body. Now consider the consummation scene. The prince climbing to Rapunzel and sleeping with her. In earlier versions, this is not a chaste meeting, but a secret sexual act that produces twins, and the discovery leads to exile, miscarriage, blinding, and further punishment in some variants. This is not a romantic rendezvous. It is a record of the consequences of sexual agency in a world where women who bore children outside sanctioned lines were often shamed, abandoned, or legally declared illegitimate. Church court records from the 16th and 17th centuries, the diocesan cause books, are filled with cases where women are prosecuted for fornication. Fines, public penance, and removal from the household are common. The twins in Rapunzel are not a happy ending. They are a marker of illegitimate claims to inheritance and the danger that terrified elites. The witch's cutting of the hair, a brutal symbolic amputation, is another historical echo. Cutting a woman's hair has been a punitive practice, a mark of shame used in early modern Europe to humiliate and separate women from social power. In French Revolutionary records, and earlier, head shaving is recorded as punishment for collaborators, accused prostitutes, or as ritual humiliation. In Rapunzel, the haircut is not a vanity strip. It is a legal and social castration of mobility, the severing of a root that allowed the prince access. When La Force cuts Percinet's hair, or the witch in Grimm trims Rapunzel, the tale is describing the removal of agency and the swift reassertion of patriarchal control. Historical documents back this interpretation. The Pentamerone manuscript of 1634 preserves the bargaining and supernatural guardian. La Force's Percinet, published 1698 in Contes des Fées, shifts the emphasis to exile and punishment. The Grimm brothers' 1812 text reframes these elements for a burgeoning middle-class audience, but keeps the punitive arc intact. John Gerard's Herbal, 1597, documents the cultural value of Rapunzel plants, the very object at the story's ignition. Tudor state papers and Tower records attest to the practice of imprisoning noblewomen for political and sexual reasons in 1536 and elsewhere. These are not metaphors, they are bleeding history through paper, and there are reconstructed scenes you cannot unsee. Picture the walled German garden in the frost of the 1600s, a hungry woman pressing cold fingers through iron bars to steal a green leaf, the soil taste in her mouth the neighbors shout across the hedge, the ledger where the household disputes are recorded. Picture the Tower of London's cell in May 1536, torches guttering against damp stone, Anne Boleyn wrapped in a woolen cloak, the smell of sweat and paper and wet straw, the clatter of a warder's keys as state machinery closes over a woman's body. These are sensory anchors that splice the tale to historical brutality. Read this chain of versions and documents, and the sanitized Disney tale falls away. Rapunzel is not an isolated story about love and escape. It is a palimpsest of property law, sexual surveillance, punitive exile, and social control. Each version is a shaving away of detail, until children's books hide the ledger entries and state papers beneath a bow. When you go back to the story now, you won't just see a girl with long hair. You will see bargained children, stolen greens, legal claims filed in municipal books, wardens watching towers, and women punished for the only crimes folk tradition says they committed: hunger, desire, and bearing children outside sanctioned control. That sanitized braid of animated comfort is braided over a record of real human containment. The fairy tale was never innocent. It was a retelling that hid the ledger until you open the books and the horror leaks out. Remember that next time you hear the song. Rapunzel is not simply rescued. She is the reminder that societies have always bought, sold, and confined bodies to protect property. Once you know that, you can never see the tower the same way again.